Hi, I'm Jake.
Hi, I'm Iris.
Today we're going to be talking about a new age of warfare initiated by the use of poison gas.
Before the 20th centuries, land battles relied on artillery, often with muskets and cannons, and were mainly composed of large units of men. However, by the turn of the century, large tactical changes such as smaller troops and more complicated and mass-produced weapons transpired. For example, the early rise of machine gun weaponry was seen in technologies like the Maxim gun, made in 1884, that could shoot 550 to 600 rounds per minute, or the first hand-driven machine gun made in 1861 called the Gatling gun. These guns are nowhere near as advanced as modern-day artillery, but the use of them has been a staple in wars across the world. Later, many armies would use bombings, gas, and other large weapons in conjunction with machine guns, showing their continued importance throughout time. Wartime technology continued to develop into the 20th century as more and more wars occurred, and a trend towards mass production methods appeared due to industrialism. As technology developed rapidly, making bigger, more powerful guns, factories were able to mass produce them, which only made wars exponentially more dangerous. Emergence of these weapons made a debut in World War I with the employment of poison gas. A new age of widespread mass cruelty and more deadly warfare strategies was signified by the employment of poison gas in World War I, because after its introduction, countries were pushed to produce more destructive technologies to not fall behind competition. A large factor that contributed to the creation of other deadly war tactics was the normalization of it. As soldiers and governments saw the horrors of new technology like poison gas, they were eager to do anything to put them back at the advantage, which often meant producing more dangerous weapons. They felt as if they had no other choice but to fight back any way they could, and soon people became desensitized to what these lethal weapons actually did to people physically and psychologically. With no moral inhibitions and a need to win, countries began ruthlessly deploying poison gas, tanks, and bombs. This all waved in a new age of mass cruelty.
So, we know in the past century or so, a new age of war has been marked. Can you tell me more about how that kicked off?
Of course, Iris, I want to go back to the beginning, the start of chemical warfare. The first use of poison gas during a large-scale battle was on April 22, 1915, on the front in Ypres. The German military unleashed it upon the Allied trenches, causing mass panic and suffering. At the time, there existed no way to prepare for or treat victims in a gas attack. The chlorine gas used irritates lung tissue and causes a choking effect that can lead to death. Chemical warfare is a new topic. Gases, herbicides, and other weapons of mass destruction were all new technological innovations that had taken place during the 20th century. One may ask how, or perhaps why. Well, governments and military agencies sought new ways to force the enemy's defeat, retreat, or surrender. One way that they could manage this was by experimenting and developing programs that specialized in making new types of weapons. Thus, after the German army used it on Ypres, there existed a hole in the Allied forces which they could pass through. However, when manufacturing the gas, little acknowledgement was given to the physical effects of it. The prospect of an easy victory resulted in no sympathy for the excruciating symptoms some of these gases had. William Pressey, a British bombardier and artillery officer, witnessed these events while he was stationed in Ypres. He describes being forced into a makeshift gas mask. It was very uncomfortable and pinched soldiers' noses. However, Pressey was already choking from the gas as the mask was shoved on. He noticed that he was gasping for air, quote, like a fish, unquote, and, quote, it seemed as if my lungs were gradually shutting up and my heart pounded in my ears like the beat of a drum, unquote. Pressey was shocked as to the horrifying scene that surrounded him. A fellow soldier had green stuff oozing from his mouth. Pressey describes the pain as so severe that it was agony. The less air he could breathe was congruent with less pain. Pressey was convinced that he was going to die. His first-hand interaction with the gas gives insight into the relative novelty of the weapon. There was no plan, no help, and everyone scrambled to escape the massive clouds of chlorine gas. While ambush and surprise attacks have been a continuity throughout history, never before was it as quickly destructive and safe for the perpetrators as now. The Germans could attack without putting their own lives at stake. Torturous methods have always been used in war, but now technology was the culprit. There remained a lack of concern with the effects or humaneness of the gas, as long as a side could defeat their enemy as easily as possible. War became less about battles and more about the mindless slaughter that deceit could bring forth.
So we've explained the use of poison gas. Iris, could you tell me about some other weapons that were developed after the invention of poisonous gas?
Sure, Jake.
Nuclear physicist Otto Hahn, Lise Meitner, and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission in Berlin, Germany in 1938, which allowed for the creation of the atom bomb. They found that when radioactive materials split into nuclei, there was a powerful release of energy which was harnessed to create a massive explosion. With this knowledge, the Manhattan Project was put into motion under J. Robert Oppenheimer with the goal of creating a functional atom bomb for World War II, which was influenced by the rumors of other German scientists working on a similar weapon. Even though the war in Europe had ended, Japan refused to surrender as they believed dying was better than giving up. Battles were very costly and deadly. Numbers only grew as Americans moved from beach to beach to no avail. After President Harry S. Truman gave Japan a warning to surrender with no answer, on August 6, 1945, Enola Gay dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, killing 80,000 people instantly. Then, on August 9, 1945, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing 39,000 people. After having two cities completely leveled, the emperor surrendered. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a man who survived both bombs, described his gruesome experience.
When the bomb first went off, he hid in a ditch, yet the shockwave lifted him in the air and spun him around. His face and forearms were badly burned beyond recognition, and both his eardrums were ruptured. On his train ride to escape Hiroshima, he noted, quote, "The journey took them through a nightmarish landscape of still flickering fires, shattered buildings, and charred and melted corpses lining the streets," unquote. It is much easier now to debate the morality of using 2 atom bombs, but at the time, having just stormed Okinawa and losing up to 100,000 men, the U.S. government believed it was their best option. President Truman, upon revealing the use of the bomb, said, quote, "The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war in the Far East," unquote. This reflected the trend of being pushed to produce and use deadly technology to flip stalemates and not fall behind other countries, seeing production was influenced by rumors of Germans doing the same. Many did not believe a single bomb could destroy an entire city, as the technology was so new, staying on course with the rapid development of weapons of mass destruction and cruelty. Seeing worse and more severe weapons desensitize people to using even worse weapons, as the only way to win was to outdo the last person. The new age of technological development and warfare started with poison gas, and now stretched to the potential of wiping entire cities off the earth.
That was quite a jump from poisonous gas. Could you give an example of another use of chemical warfare?
Sure, moving farther into the 20th century, another well-known incident is the use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War by the U.S.
The U.S. knew it was losing massive amounts of money, and as anti-war protests began to spike, Operation Ranch Hand was put into motion in 1962. And over the next 9 years, 11.4 million gallons of Agent Orange was sprayed throughout the thick jungle of Vietnam, which in the end added up to the size of Massachusetts. The goal of Agent Orange, which is a harmful herbicide and defoliant, was to break down the unfamiliar battleground of the Vietnamese jungle to uncover the Viet Cong, which, in theory, would save many lives. The Viet Cong, a North Vietnamese rebel group, utilized vicious guerrilla warfare, something common for the 20th century, setting many death traps, forcing American soldiers to live in complete terror and paranoia. The savior that was supposed to turn the tides of the war had everlasting effects on soldiers from both sides. After U.S. veterans confronted their government, who repeatedly dismissed the harmful effects of Agent Orange as communist propaganda, a scientific study was done that linked dioxin to have deadly birth defects in lab animals. Even after the defoliant was banned in 1970, proving its long-lasting toxicity, the U.S. government and producers like Dow Chemical denied its potency due to lack of scientific consensus, even with heaps of evidence and personal testimony. Even though this dangerous chemical was killing not only Vietnamese citizens, but also American soldiers, the government and big companies still defended themselves and continued to use it in the name of winning a war. It wasn't the first time a chemical marked and used for domestic purposes has instead been used in warfare and massacres. As Hitler was carrying out the Holocaust, two large German firms, Tesch and Dagesch, produced and sold enough Zyklon B to kill 2 million people. Zyklon B was often the poison used in gas chambers during the genocide. After the war, companies stated they had no clue it was being used on humans, but after finding letters detailing how to use proper ventilation and heating equipment, the directors were sentenced to prison. However, those at Dow Chemical Company were never punished and in fact were declared to have no responsibility for Agent Orange and dismissed all other legal claims. Though both places directly and indirectly killed thousands.
Agent Orange was used to expose troops by cutting down vegetation. The perpetrators of this, however, did not take into consideration what the destruction and poisoning of so much of Vietnam's agriculture would have on the effects of soldiers and innocents' health. Using chemicals to fight had already been around for a few decades, yet there was no research on what the herbicide could do before we, the U.S., employed it. This callousness regarding the lives of innocent has been a constant throughout history, yet further developments in technology and chemical warfare, as well as powers and uses for certain weapons, exponentially grew and became more brutal since the first use of poison gas.
While mentioned are only a few examples of these weapons, it is important to recognize the pattern that's established.
Prior to the first use of poison gas in 1915, war had been fought between two sides with methods such as guns and small bombs, and before that, swords and catapults. The introduction of chemical warfare onto the battlefront marked the start of a new era of warfare. Now enemies could be defeated through obscure and unconventional manners, such as gassing their crops, and unleashing the power of the sun upon millions of innocents to force surrender. These changes add upon the deceitful legacy of war throughout history. However, they represent an increasing pattern of using technology to be cruel and destructive. The atmosphere of war was forever changed to be deadlier, more swift, and more agonizing by that very first gas development.
Frequently, governments and big companies play a much bigger role in deploying deadly weapons and committing atrocities on innocent populations than you think.
While soldiers are the ones who carry out gassing and bombings usually, it's on the order from authorities, especially when people were forcefully drafted and had no choice but to follow commands, and if they didn't, there were usually harsh punishments. The lack of insight governments have displayed in things such as the long-term effects of Agent Orange, or what would follow after the first uses of poison gas at Ypres, have often led to worsening chain reactions over time.